Thank you all for coming to the talk tonight. Tonight's lecture is part of an ongoing series of lectures, discussions, and visiting lectures at CASAR, in which we're trying to understand and explain the nature of American economic, military, and cultural power in the world. During a critical moment, when it appears that this power is undergoing transformation, if not outright decline. We've hosted conversations about how America goes to war, how America intervenes or not in global affairs, and how America engages with economic crises at home and abroad. Tonight's lecture maps the relationship between economy and war, and continues an ongoing conversation we will have throughout the year. Our distinguished speaker tonight is the prolific author and investigative journalist Pratap Chatterjee. Chatterjee is the author of 4 books, the most recent of which are Iraq, Inc., A Profitable Occupation, and Halliburton's Army, featured here. How a well-connected Texas oil company revolutionized the way America makes war. He serves as the executive director of Corp Watch, an Oakland-based corporate accountability organization. He also works for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London. He writes regularly for The Guardian and serves on the board of Amnesty International USA and the Corporate Europe Observatory. Chatterjee's lecture tonight is titled The U.S. War of Terror, How Contractors Profit from Interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and Eavesdropping on Facebook and Google. Please help me welcome Pratap Chatterjee. On the scratch paper.
Sorry. So, actually, to begin, if I may, I hope people will indulge me. It would be nice actually to get a sense of who's in the room, since I don't work on this campus. I have absolutely no idea who you are. So there are a lot of people, but would it be too much to ask people to just say maybe their name and where they're from? I mean, you don't have to. You could just. Oh, is that too much?
That would take too much people here.
Too many people?
How many students are there?
Okay, well that's a good way of doing it. So mostly, and what departments? KESA, okay. Is it mostly KESA?
No.
Oh, no, okay. Public health? Public health and KESA mostly? Oh. Okay, I won't embarrass all of you. Business school. Oh, okay. Okay, good.
And there's some faculty.
Okay.
CIA agents.
Oh, good. Is that you?
Maybe. Consulate and ambassadorial.
Right. Indeed. Going. Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. Thank you, Alex and Vijay, for inviting me. I'm going to try and go over a few different things together and try and pull them together, but I want to apologize at the very beginning because I'm a journalist, I'm not an academic, so I don't know the frames and the theories and that sort of thing. So I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories. I'm going to try and see if there's some method in the madness of the American war of terror throughout the Middle East region and Central Asia. So the first thing I want to do is actually give you some numbers, because when you give out numbers, it makes you seem very credible. So if I say things happened, you won't believe me unless I say 223 people died at 5 p.m. and then it becomes legitimate. So let me start with some numbers. And since this talk is on contractors, I want to give you a sense of the size of contracting in America. So the U.S. government has a budget of about $3.3 trillion. And of that, they spend about $560 billion on contractors. So that's roughly 1 in every $7. So this is not just the military. Throughout government agencies, a lot of people are hired to work for the government using contract vehicles. That's what they call them. Now, most of that money, that $560 billion plus give or take, is spent by the military, about $370 billion. And they have about 250,000 companies they contract with, and they use it for some very expensive things, like there's the B-2 Spirit bomber, which is I think made by Northrop Grumman, worth $1.2 billion, or the F-22 Raptor, which is worth $420 million. But a lot of it is also spent on personnel, on individuals. And a lot of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is continuing to happen today, is money spent on individuals. And there are a couple of reasons for that, and these are the two reasons I want to focus on. One is what Peter Singer calls the dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs, and the second is things for political reasons. So the American soldier, or any soldier going back centuries, had a hard life, right? So they went out to war, they carried their weapons, they carried their food, they had to slog, and they had to march through, trenches, and then they had to, endure scurvy and all sorts of other dangerous, things because of poor sanitation and bleeding in the field and that sort of thing. So what has happened today is that the US military is trying to use contractors to make that life and the war easier for soldiers to get people into the field, into a war that they would not normally want to fight. Back in Vietnam, and I'm using Vietnam as a reference to the US war in Vietnam, soldiers in the United States were required to go. They were drafted, right? So they had no choice. Unless you were privileged enough, you had to go. And a lot of people who went to war didn't want to be there. So one of the important things that the US government set out to do in this current war was convince soldiers that they would have a good time. They would be able to come back without dying, right? So an improvement in medical care, but also an improvement in feeding them, in sanitation, in providing facilities. So how do they do that? Well, they stop making soldiers do the dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs. So no longer do they carry their bags, no longer do they clean their toilets, no longer do they cook their food. All that is outsourced. And so this makes it a lot easier to go to war when somebody cooks and cleans for you. You have maid service when you go to, effectively, you don't have maids, but you have the equivalent of maid service when an American soldier goes to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a big percentage of the money that's spent. And of course you also have the people who do, that's the dull jobs and the dirty jobs. Then you have the dangerous jobs. And those are the people in the periphery. So if you're a soldier, you have to pull guard duty. Well, why do you need to pull guard duty when you could hire somebody from another country to do that guard duty for you? So when the US contracts people, they're contracting janitors, they're contracting security guards to protect their convoys and to stand outside their embassies and take care of them so they can do the business of killing more efficiently. So that is the purpose of the whole contracting in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I started with the $370 billion, which is spent every year on the military. Well, on top of that, there's another, roughly speaking, $130 billion that was spent in the last 5 years just on contractors in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And just to give you a sense of what that means, that's enough money to spend on providing sanitation and clean water to everybody in the world. Is the amount of money that is spent every year in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that is spent purely for the soldiers. Now, in addition to that, there is reconstruction money, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the money that is spent on the war of terror for the soldiers. I wanted to give you a little bit of context in case you felt that this was something, this contracting was something that's new, because it's not. People have always been contracted, like Blackwater, to go to war, going back over centuries. So going back to the Italians, the first war in Iraq, the first American war in Iraq, where they brought contractors to do work. And in Vietnam, the same thing. Americans used contractors to do things. And so I wanted to read you and see if anybody could guess who made this statement. It dates to 1967. And first, does everybody know who Halliburton is, the company Halliburton? Raise your hand if you don't know who Halliburton is. Okay, so there's a couple of people. Halliburton is a very big company in Houston, Texas. And one of the reasons it's famous is because it was run by Dick Cheney, and I think probably everybody's heard of Dick Cheney, the former Vice President of the United States, for 5 years, from 1995 to 2000. So a lot of people believe that Dick Cheney, because he was CEO, gave contracts to Halliburton during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan because it would profit him and his people. Now, reality is a little more complicated than that, but this is why I actually wanted to read you this little passage. It's from 1967, and it's a member of Congress who goes to Vietnam, to then the US war in Vietnam, and he visits a military base where, like you do in Iraq and Afghanistan, you had contractors building the bases, cooking and cleaning, not at the extent that they do today. And when he returned, he came to Congress and he complained about this company. The company's name was Brown and Root Services. Later became Kellogg Brown and Root, owned by Halliburton, the company that Dick Cheney ran for 5 years. And this is what the member of Congress said. He said, "Why this huge contract is not now being adequately audited is beyond me. The potential for waste and profiteering under such a contract is substantial." And he talked about how the president was being paid by this company. So remember Dick Cheney, etc. Who was this congressman, or what was his affiliation? Does anybody have any guesses as to who this man was? This man later became very famous. Any guesses here? Did I hear something? McCain? Oh. McCain, no, you're close though. McCain was not in Congress at the time, if I remember my history correctly. He was a soldier at the time. This is 1967. So,
George Bush Sr.?
Not Bush Sr. A lot of people guess Dick Cheney, and the reason Dick Cheney is wrong, although you would be close, is in '67 he was a draft dodger, and he was in college trying to avoid going to Vietnam altogether. No, it was his later boss, and Donald Rumsfeld. So the man who went to Vietnam and then came back and protested against Halliburton was Donald Rumsfeld, then a 28-year-old congressman. So fast forward 40 years, and Donald Rumsfeld hires Halliburton to go to Iraq and Afghanistan to do all this work. Why? Because he wants soldiers to go there, and he wants to make sure that there's somebody to provide support to them so that they will agree to fight. And there's this journalist for the New Yorker, Sarah Stillman, who has this wonderful quote about how soldiers, when they went to war in Vietnam, came back 15 pounds lighter. Today, when soldiers return from the front, American soldiers return from the front, they come back 10 pounds heavier. And it's because they're being fed well by an army contracted by Halliburton, hence the name of the book, Halliburton's Army. And this is an army of menial labor from the Philippines, from India, from Pakistan. These are people who are paid low wages to provide the creature comforts that Americans growing up today expect to receive. So I want to break down a little bit about what this means in terms of the American taxpayer. I realize you may not be American taxpayers, but one of the things that the complaints from the left and from is that this, as Donald Rumsfeld said back in 1967, this contracting opens itself up for waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's true. So certainly in the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, I traveled a lot. I've been to Iraq 4 times, Afghanistan 4 times, and my job was to go and try and figure out whether these contractors were wasting money. And it was actually quite easy to do. You just looked up a project and you went and talked to people there, and generally the money was being wasted. And I can give you hundreds of examples, but I'll give you a couple. There's a town called Halabja, and I don't know how many people have heard of Halabja. Halabja, quite a lot. Halabja is famous because Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds, right? This was one of the reasons why we were going, the Americans, the British, whatever, were going to Iraq, was to protect the people of Iraq. And I got there, I think, in perhaps 2006 or so. And it was actually kind of sad because once America invaded, they said, we're going to save the people here, we're going to do things for them. They came and they said, we're going to build you schools, hospitals, water systems. And then they hired contractors to do that work. 3 years later, there's no clean water, no clinics, nothing. Where had the money gone? Well, they'd given it to American companies to do this work because it was easier to pay the money out and then tell the American people that the job was being done. And so I went on this mission to try and find these hospitals they're building. I went to this place called Halabja Taza, which is near Halabja, and I looked for this hospital that was supposedly being built by this company from LA called Parsons. And we stumbled through the night, there was no electricity, and eventually find the hospital, and we discover that the roof had caved in, or actually was leaking, it hadn't caved in yet, but it might have, and it had been abandoned. And what was happening was, when America arrived, it gave money to the soldiers, it gave money to reconstruction companies, and it says, what we have done, what we are trying to achieve is being done by these companies. And we are fulfilling our promises. Only the problem was, the companies knew that nobody was going to come and check up on their work. So therefore, they wasted the money, and the projects never were never completed. So much so, there's a story, there's a man by the name of Robert Stein, and he was hired to be a construction supervisor in Iraq. So when he gets there, they discover they didn't have anybody to handle the money. So they said, you're a supervisor, we'll put you in charge of supervising the money. So Robert Stein was asked to build things in Hilla in central Iraq, and he was given a budget of some $80 million. And he was told, repair police station, equip the library. So what does he do? He starts writing checks to his friends. And his friends arrive, and they use that money to buy themselves guns, to buy themselves cars, gold watches, and the money just goes down the drain. The problem was, because this wasn't planned, the contractors had a field day. And at some point, the United States started to realize the money was being wasted, and then, being defrauded from the taxpayer. The rough numbers, there's a special inspector general for Iraq reconstruction that was created to monitor the money. The guy who ran it, Stuart Bowen, was actually a former lawyer for George Bush, and his estimate was that out of $53 billion, $8 billion was wasted completely. And a lot of the other money just went to contracts to people that the Americans want to make friends with. So I'll give you another example actually from Afghanistan. When Hamid Karzai was about to run for his second term in office, the Americans started to panic that Hamid Karzai would not be able to win the second term election unless he delivered something to the people. So they came up with this plan to build a power plant. And they said, if we build a power plant and we deliver electricity to the people, they're going to be happy and they'll vote him back. So they hire a company from Kansas, and they say, build us a power plant. The budget the company came up with was $120 million. And they said, you need to build this in 1 year. And of course, it wasn't feasible. These guys flew in transformers from Mexico. They had custom-built turbines built in Germany. And they built this power plant. At the end, it cost $300 million. And they were never able to turn it on. I mean, they turned it on, but it barely functioned, because the budget of running that power plant at full blast would have been $280 million a year, which is a third of the entire government budget, and it would have supplied 2% of electricity to the country. So it was abandoned. Oddly enough, at the same time, the Afghans, who were very friendly with the Indians, came to the Indians and said, look, we really need electricity. Well, what should we do? So an Indian company was hired, and I'm not saying that because there's somebody from the Indian consulate in the room, but this is a true story. The Indian company built a electricity plant, they built cables from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan to bring electricity from those countries down to Kabul. And so what happened was, by the time Karzai ran for re-election, electricity was back, but the Indians got the credit because the American plant had failed, and the money had been wasted, and nobody used it at all. So even their plan to try and deliver political votes to Karzai failed because they had planned it so badly. And the electricity that was sent by power lines ended up being 6 cents a kilowatt hour as opposed to 22 cents a kilowatt hour, which is what it would have cost for the American diesel-run power plant. So I guess what I'm trying to paint is the idea of a superpower invading countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, and coming up with the idea that if they get other people to do the work for them, whether it's Indian or Filipino labor or contractors, they can have their invasion, they can take over a place in a much more easy way. And they'll be able to achieve what they want and be able to go back. Unfortunately, the reality is if you don't think about things and if you don't plan them well enough and you don't work with the local population, in fact, it goes astray and it doesn't work out as you planned. So what the United States has discovered after pouring all this money into Iraq and Afghanistan, forget about the political mistakes they've made, is the money has been wasted, it has been stolen, and in many cases also abused. It has helped, of course, their friends. So that power plant I mentioned, the Tarakil power plant just outside the Kabul airport, was supplied fuel by a man by the name of Haji Hassin, Abdul Hassin. And he was the brother of the vice president of Afghanistan. So he got all the contracts for the for the diesel. And so at the end of the day, they paid off their cronies, the Karzais and the Hassins. Fahim is the name of the brother. But they achieved nothing in terms of convincing the local population of delivering some kind of services to the community that they were trying to win over. I'm going to pause, take a little bit of a break there and switch over to a different topic, partly because I was wondering if there are any CIA agents in the room. There's a question I have for you. So you can tell me later, because most of the story that you've probably heard about contractors is generally the story of companies like Blackwater. And so who here has not heard of Blackwater? One person, okay. Well, Blackwater is famous because they're the men with guns. So in addition to doing the dull and dangerous and the crowd-pleasing kind of work, the other thing that the Americans want to do is make sure that their boys don't get killed. So the easy way of doing that is hiring people to do dangerous tasks. So at the very basic level, if you go to Baghdad today, or if you went there 5 years ago, if you entered an American compound, the first people you encounter are not American soldiers, but soldiers from Uganda or from Sierra Leone, who are paid $100 a month to stand in front of a building and hold a gun so that if somebody comes and attacks the location, the first person who dies is not an American soldier, but somebody they're paying less money because this is dangerous. On the other hand, when they're traveling, this is what they call static security, and I'm sure there's a lot of static security here in Beirut too, right? But in America, they also have what they call, in Iraq and Afghanistan, they also have what's called mobile security. And I don't know if you have as much here as they do there, but Blackwater was famous because their men wore Ray-Bans, drove around the wrong way down the traffic and shot at people. And one of the things they were most famous for was something called the Nisour Square Massacre, which, if I remember correctly, was in 2007, where Blackwater was going through a Blackwater convoy protecting the State Department was going the wrong way down traffic, and then they perceived a threat. So they opened fire and they killed 17 people. And so then all hell broke loose because people said, well, who are these guys? These are not members of the military. Why are they killing people? And this is a real problem. And this became the perception of American contractors, men with guns, who shot at anything that moved, and or we could go down another route and talk about the contractors in Abu Ghraib who were involved in torture. But the perception grew of these guys who were out of control. So here's my question, actually, because these guys mostly worked for construction companies. There's a new group that I became aware of recently called Global Response Staff. Does this ring a bell to anybody? Because they have people here. So Global Response Staff is actually a unit of the Central Intelligence Agency, and they have about 125 people around the world. It's a very small unit, and their job is to accompany people, CIA people, on CIA work. And these are people, generally ex-special forces, and they're individual contractors, sometimes from Blackwater, and their job is to do dirty and dangerous things that nobody else wants to do, or that if an American got caught at, could get into trouble for, because there would be a diplomatic incident. And you may have heard of one of them, or you may have heard of a couple of them. The most famous GRS contractor was a man by the name of Raymond Davis. Does anybody here know the name Raymond Davis? Maybe it's a bit, well, Vijay does. Raymond Davis worked in Pakistan, and he worked for the CIA, and he became famous because he was doing some kind of spying activity, and he was driving down a road in Lahore when two young men stepped in front of his car and pointed guns at him. And he, since he worked for the CIA, became a little worried. He pulled out a Glock and he fired through his windshield and he killed both of them. And then he radioed for help. So the embassy or consulate in Lahore sent, an SUV to rescue him. They drove the wrong way down the street, killed another person on a motorcycle, and then rescued him. But, they didn't. They weren't able to rescue him. He went to a Lahore jail. And all of Pakistan was in a huge uproar because they said, who is this guy? Why is this American shooting and killing people? Well, it turned out he worked for the CIA, and it was his job to accompany people. Now, if you haven't heard of Raymond Davis, you probably heard of Benghazi, the attacks on the State Department compound. Well, you may recall that again over there were a number of people who were killed, but among them there were some civilian contractors. They too worked for global response staff. A third example is from Khost, Afghanistan. And again, does anybody remember this incident in Khost where a CIA compound was blown up by a Jordanian doctor? Have people heard of it? Some people? No. Again, this is GRS. So what the CIA is doing is hiring people to do the difficult tasks, right, where they want plausible deniability. Because one of the things is, in addition to wanting comfort from in a war zone, Americans are notoriously loath not to want to die in a war zone. So it's easier to hire people and pay them, if you're Indian, $100 a month to do janitorial works, or if you're American, pay you, and if you're considering a job at GRS, the pay is about $140,000 a year, and you work 6 months of the year, to do the dangerous Jason Bourne kind of work. So, which leads me to the final point of my talk. How are we doing? Okay. Which is, it's interesting actually to see, I gave this talk actually here at AUB 5 years ago, not exactly the same talk because some of the things I'm talking about are, and there seem to be more people who are aware of all of these things. Now, it's my feeling that in the last 5 years people have stopped reporting on the excesses of American contractors. And for a couple of different reasons. One is the media is not that interested in criticizing the Democratic party. But the second is because the war is no longer a war on the ground. It's been outsourced. It's been removed from physical locations on the ground to a surveillance war and a drone war. So today, instead of having soldiers going in and contractors follow them, it is now a remote control war. And so a lot of my reporting in recent years has been on those contractors, the people who work in the drone war and the people who work in the surveillance war for the NSA, for example. And how many people here have heard of Edward Snowden? Everybody, okay. So Edward Snowden was a contractor. I would say a good contractor because he blew the whistle on his employer, but he worked for a company called Booz Allen Hamilton. And so today, what the US military does is instead of invading countries, they are now trying to track people and figure out what people are doing by installing software on their computers or tracking their cell phones. So the war has changed from a war where you send a soldier in to talk to people to a war which you use contractors to tap people's phones, track them on a giant satellite screen like you see in Hollywood, and then figure out how to kill them with a drone. Because that way you don't have to, well, forget about the money, but you don't have to pay Halliburton. Halliburton's been paid $40 billion in the last 10 years to provide food for the soldiers. You no longer have to spend the money on the food, and you don't even have to worry about the plausible deniability. You don't even have to worry about being killed because the war is now being conducted from the United States. The people who push the buttons to kill people in the drone war are actually sitting in Holloman-based New Mexico, or they're sitting in Nevada, or they're sitting in Langley, and the war is now conducted from desktops. So I want to close actually with a little vignette just from some of my work. It's not actually drone related. well, 2 vignettes actually, but to explain where this war is going and what the problem is with it. So the first vignette is from my personal experiences, and I was in Islamabad about 3 years ago at a conference put on by a very good organization called Reprieve. It was a jirga in which they brought people down from Waziristan, and they brought people down from Waziristan to talk about the drone war. These were relatives of people who had been killed by American missiles, Hellfire missiles, or in a couple of cases actually people who had been injured actually by drone missiles. So they held this conference and I filmed the whole thing. I met them, they had a special dinner and we hung out with them for a day and we talked to all these people. And among them I met a quiet young man by the name of Tariq Aziz. And if you recognize the name Tariq Aziz from the foreign minister of Iraq, it's not that surprising because I don't know if this is true in Beirut, but in India and in Pakistan, a lot of people are named after famous people. So Tariq Aziz was probably named after the Iraqi foreign minister. His friend sitting next to him, his name was Saddam Hussein. So this is true. And it would be funny, except that it wasn't that funny. It was tragic, ultimately. 3 days after I met him, and I filmed him, I have the footage, although probably too hard to show it to you. After we left, he went back to his village, and the CIA killed him with a drone. And we have footage of his funeral, testimonies from his family. And so, I mean, to me, I mean, sometimes, you know, you working in war zones, you have friends who are journalists who get killed or kidnapped, but it's rare that you meet somebody who's been targeted and killed. So when that happened, I was obviously beside myself. I wrote an op-ed in The Guardian. My friend Clive wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, and I called the CIA and I said, why did you kill this man? And of course they wouldn't call me back. But they did talk to the Washington Post, and they said, well, we know this guy was a terrorist, you know. And I said, well, how do you know he was a terrorist? He was 16. He had his cousin with him who was 12. And they said, well, we are sure, but we can't show you the evidence. They told the Post, not me. And I said, well, to me, and this brings it back to a reading that Vijay assigned to the students who are from Qassar. What they said was, well, this is their argument. These people are so dangerous, you know, that we have no option but to kill them, right? And if those of you that are in Vijay's class probably read or were supposed to read 2 articles, I'm not assuming that you haven't read it, 2 recent reports, one from Amnesty International and one from Human Rights Watch, looking at victims of the drone war, one from Yemen and the other from Pakistan, where they recount exactly the same experiences. Mine are more sort of, I met this guy, I don't know much about him. Theirs is much more lawyerly and scientific. But to me, after this jirga, there was a protest in front of the parliament, and we all went there in vans, and I filmed these protests, etc. And to me, the question I asked in my piece for The Guardian and the CIA is, if you were so sure that man was a terrorist, why couldn't you have come to that jirga and questioned him there? Why couldn't you have renditioned him? Why couldn't you have tortured him? What Obama did, and this is what I really object to, and this is why, you know, I have such a problem with the current administration, is they killed him. They didn't give him an opportunity to speak for himself. They didn't give him a lawyer. They killed him. So in my opinion, what we have done now is taken a war, an invasion, where we have used, you know, Indian labor and American soldiers, to now a technological war where we kill people with buttons. And that is, we are relying on technology. So now for my final example, which I think is even more telling than my personal anecdote, which is of an incident that happened in Afghanistan. And it was in a province called Tahar province. So in 2009, NATO used a missile to kill a man whom they said was the shadow Taliban leader of the province. So they killed him and 9 people around him. Now this is not a CIA strike, this is a NATO strike. It's on their website. So you can get there, I can send you the link if you're interested. I sent actually a link to this thing to Vijay, so you could ask him also. And in this thing, they said, we killed him because he's a shadow governor of the Taliban. Now, what was interesting is there's a very good group called the Afghan Analyst Network. And when they named this individual that they had killed, there's a person who works at AAN whose name is Kate Clark, and she's a former BBC reporter. She said, that's really strange. I know this man that they killed, and I don't remember the name. So she went to Tahar province and interviewed people and said, and this guy was actually a prisoner of the Taliban when he lived in Pakistan during the time of the Taliban or whatever. And she found it hard to believe that he would have been, a Taliban leader, given that he had been imprisoned and tortured by them or whatever. So she asked people, and they said, no, he's not a terrorist. We saw him every day on television because he was campaigning with his nephew. His nephew was running for a local municipal position. They knew who he was. And so Kate Clark went back to NATO and said, why did you kill this man, right? He, is an ordinary individual. But what was even better, or what was even more important in some ways, was the man they claimed to have killed, the shadow governor of that province, was still alive. And there's this academic whose name I've forgotten. He's Irish, and he teaches between Dublin, Harvard, and Islamabad. But he actually met the man, the shadow governor of the Taliban. He talked to him, rather.
Rory Stewart.
What?
Rory Stewart.
No, it's not Rory Stewart. It's a different guy. And he confirmed that the person, so they said this individual is the shadow governor. But he determined the individual who's the shadow governor was still alive and well. So Kate Clark said, if that man is still alive, who did you kill? And they said, we were tracking his telephone. And that's how we know who it was. And this is what it's come to. And the problem today is the war is dependent now on a system of surveillance by which they track your cell phone or your email, and then they decide you must be the person. So they killed the person they wanted to kill because he had the telephone that they thought marked him as the shadow governor. They had the wrong telephone number. Thank you. Sorry. There was some water. Thank you.
Two points concerning Halliburton. The corruption was from the beginning. There was no bidding between companies, contractors that had to go to Iraq. So from the beginning, it was well known that it was the favorite of Cheney and that they wanted to make money out of it.
So that's actually a very interesting question, and that is actually the theme of my book, Halliburton's Army. Thank you. And the funny thing is, whenever people talk about Halliburton, I've been on, people be like, tell us about how Dick Cheney gave the contract to Halliburton so he could make some money. And the funny thing about this book, which has been positively reviewed by the US military and is about corruption, is actually that Cheney didn't give them the contract. And even though it was a no-bid contract, it was a limited bid contract. So the rules of contracting in the US military are very arcane. There's something called the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is 1,800 pages long. So they gave out, there were a number of contracts, and the contract for Restore Iraqi Oil was a no-bid contract, as you pointed out. But the contract for managing the bases, the log cap contract, was actually a limited bid contract. And one of the problems was that in order to give a contract to somebody to manage bases throughout a war zone, you don't want to give it to somebody who's never done it before. You want to give it to somebody who already has experience. So who do you have that has managed bases and built bases before? Well, actually, there was only one company that had done that, going all the way back to Vietnam, as I mentioned before, and that was Halliburton. So even though it was a limited bid, I feel that they would probably be the only company that would have got it. So there's also a lot of people have said, well, Dick Cheney, gave them the contract because, and it's funny because the woman who actually signed the contract paper, and she protested it, she's a whistleblower, her name is Bunny Greenhouse. She said this contract was unfairly awarded because it's going to cost us too much. I said, so did Dick Cheney talk to you? And she said, I never met Dick Cheney. So then I called up the head of the Army Corps of Engineers and I said, so did Dick Cheney talk to you? And he said, no. So I said, well then how did they get the contract? So the contracting system and one of the reasons I read you the Rumsfeld quote is this is not a partisan or political thing. There's a system of contracting that's very arcane, and if you understand it, once you're big enough, you get all the contracts. So the Halliburton had the contract in Bosnia for the bases there, and they got that contract actually the month before Cheney became CEO. So it's a long process by which, at the end of the day, they end up being the only qualified bidder who could do the contract. I hate to say this. I really, really hate to say this because, of course, I am a shareholder in Halliburton KBR, so I can attend the meetings. But it's not because I want to defend them. But the truth of the matter is that they didn't. The contract was a no-bid contract, but it was not unfairly awarded to them. So I hate to say that, but I'm a journalist and I have to be honest.
Second point.
Okay.
I don't know whether I got you right. You said the U.S. went to Iraq to protect the people of Iraq?
Well, that's what they tell the people of America. They say we are protecting.
Okay,
right,
because the chemical weapons were given by the U.S. To Saddam Hussein to fight Iran. Yeah.
You're right. You're right. And what they tell the public in America is very different from the reality of, But what they claim is we has chemical weapons, we have to protect his people, we've got to protect the Kurds in Halabja, 5,000 of whom died, etc. And of course, all that was a lie, right? So there was a question here and then back there. Go ahead.
The shift towards technological, more technological wars, war. Is it? How does it compute with the contractors? Does it mean that they'll get more money and more, or will it be more nationalized in a way?
Okay, so the war. So again, remember, there's a cost question. There's the dirty dollar dangerous question, and there's the political. How do you sell this to the people in America? The drone war is actually a lot cheaper, right? Because you don't have to pay people large salaries. So it's much cheaper. A Hellfire missile, a drone doesn't cost that much money. It's more complex because it involves a lot more software and a lot more guesswork and things like that. But and much of the software, the targeting is done by private contractors. But the amount of money they spend, and there are no hard figures on this because this is unlike the ground war where you have the numbers they're given to Congress. Most of these numbers are not public. But my guess is this is actually a cheaper war. But it is very much a contractor war. 70% of the intelligence budget in the United States is used on contractors. So the CIA has what are called green badges. Even the people who work in the CIA, a lot of time is they come in on contracts. So it is still very much a contractor war. However, at the end of the day, like the land war, the person who pushes the button, who pulls the trigger, is generally a person who is a federal employee or soldier. But the intelligence that's given to them by the Raymond Davises of the world or whatever is generally given by a contractor. But generally they don't make that last decision on who's going to get killed. But they could, since all the government official has to just push a button in Nevada or New Mexico, the rest of it can be given out to you. You could rent drones, and they do. There's a company whose name I'm blanking on that rents drones to the U.S. military. So you don't even need to use government aircraft anymore. They tend to, but there's a company. Actually, the war in the drone war in Africa is largely done by a lot of it's done by private contractors. There's a company from Nevada called Sierra Nevada. And then there's a company from, I think, Maryland called R4. And they have these Pilatus planes, I think that's how you pronounce it, these Swiss-made aircraft. And they are hired to beam data back to AFRICOM, which is in Stuttgart. So it is very much still a private war, and in fact, more so, I think. So, back there.
Yeah, I have a pedagogical question. I was curious about your research. So you're in Corp Watch and you follow the money, you figure out how these things are done. How easy is it to figure out? Well, you said fraud was easy, I noticed. to figure out that money was being wasted in Iraq and reconstruction was easy to find out. These are publicly traded companies. Is it more difficult to get things from the US government in terms of information or from the publicly traded companies? How do you pull this material together? Is it through talking to people? Is it through looking at their SEC filings? Like, how do you do all this?
Okay, just a little note there, because I was once asked a pedagogical question at Columbia in the Department of Education, and finally I kind of like fluffed around, and then finally when I left I was like, what does that word mean? Because I had no idea. But it's like it's education, how you study? What's the...
It's just the practice as a teacher. This is a question that we ask in, what is the methods of what...
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry, I'm really not an academic. So, I mean, very much journalistic, right? So it's talking to people on the ground. Because of Google and because of a lot of contracts are online, it's possible to get a lot of data directly from the internet, which was not possible, let's say, 20 years ago, just in terms of raw numbers. That's true also of public companies, much harder with private companies. So it's much harder with, let's say, a company like Bechtel, which is privately owned. It's true of small companies because small companies are not publicly traded. But very much, well, a lot of it is field research, right? So the reason I'm able to report on Halliburton and Blackwater is because I go to the field, I meet with people there, and there is some respect that comes from spending time in the same places as they do. So I have friends in Halliburton and Blackwater. I know the CEO of Halliburton, partly because I think I'm not friends with him, but they made it their, because I'm very outspoken about it, and they made it their business to talk to me. But people call you up as a journalist if you're writing about it. They want to talk to you. So whistleblowers. So yeah, a lot of it is talking to people on the ground, people inside the companies, their rivals. Nowadays, especially in the world of surveillance and intelligence, I'm really hopeful about this. I was recently at a police and intelligence fair in Paris, and there was all these Israeli companies that are selling technology to tap phones and things like that. So I went and talked to all of them, and then one of the Israeli guys took me aside and he said, if you want to know anything about my rivals, come talk to me and I'll help you out, right? So, but then the best thing happened. I then went and I found a Chinese company, and the Chinese company was advertising the stuff that I had never heard of, really high-end stuff in terms of tapping phones and that sort of thing. So, and they didn't exist. The company does not exist anywhere on the internet, right? So I went up to them and said, look, I'm a journalist and I want to talk to you guys. And they said, no, we cannot talk to you, you're a journalist. I said, well, this is crazy. I said, all those Israeli companies talk to me. And they even gave me their brochures. They're like, really? Do you think you could give us those brochures? I was like, well, we could do a trade. And we did. So, you can do some horse trading, So, there was another question there, and I'll come to you.
Somehow related, I wonder, National Information Act is different than the US Information Act. It actually forced government to release information related to the spending of public funds. Where
Correct.
tax money goes, citizens have the right to know. Does the same rule apply? And it includes usually third-party organizations that act either on behalf of the public or government institution, or in a similar function, like a public or state institution, Halliburton and the likes. Do they fall under this category, and what is kind of the legal mechanism of accountability or transparency that would allow us, you as a journalist, us as researchers?
Right, and that's actually another method, obviously. Sorry, I didn't want to go into lots of detail or whatever. But yeah, so the Freedom of Information Act is what it's called in the United States. So you can file a Freedom of Information Act request, and you can only file that, you can't file that to a private company or even to a public company, you file it to a government agency. But if a government agency has a contract, then you can get the contract data, right? But they can and do delete or black out information that are either national security or business secrets, which makes it very hard. And there have actually been some, there's a very famous congressman from Henry Waxman from Los Angeles, and what he did was So people FOIA'd information on Halliburton on their waste, fraud, and abuse. They sent those documents out, and then he, because he's a member of Congress, was able to get other data. He was able to get the full documents, and then he held a hearing in which he showed all the data that was deleted. And all the data that was deleted was the data, or that was blacked out, was the data that said suspected fraud or suspected waste. So having said that, and it's really an amazing comparison when you look at the two, is the companies can petition the government and say, well, if you publish this information, our rivals get it, we might lose a contract because you question our fraud. But having said that, there's still a lot of information you can get. Bunny Greenhouse, the woman, the whistleblower who blew the whistle on the fact that this is a no-bid contract, had written in the margins of the contract, this is a bad contract. And when a journalist asked for the data under Freedom of Information, when he got the data, eventually, he found that note the whistleblower had written. Well, she just wrote it, she didn't write it as, she became a whistleblower later, but then he looked at the name and he said, he tracked the woman down and he said, you wrote a note saying this is a bad contract, do you want to talk about it? And she said, okay, sure, and then they told the story. So you can get information, but it's obviously subject to whatever the government. And so the tricky thing with intelligence contracts is they will never give it to you, or it will take 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. There's a group in the United States called the National Security Archive, and they do amazing work because they do FOIA requests for journalists, typically for historical stuff. And of course, as soon as things become public, if you're a historian or an academic, their work is just amazing because they have got, now the latest thing that I think is data on the Bay of Pigs, but they have information, some of the data is declassified earlier. They've been able to, there's this guy whom I know a little bit, Jeffrey Richardson, who has built a whole knowledge base around something called Area 51. Do people know what Area 51 is? This is the place where all where the UFOs are supposed to land, etc. And he FOIA'd that information, right? And eventually, when it became declassified, he was able to reconstruct what happened. They didn't find any UFOs, but he did find evidence of clandestine government activity and that sort of thing. So that was used. Area 51 for many years was not acknowledged by the government at all, and because they were doing they were doing research on these highly toxic substances that they painted on planes to make them invisible, etc. People were dying from that. So this is another my pet peeve with the Democrats. There were a group of, I think, about 7 people who sued the government to find out about, under environmental regulations, saying we are dying of toxic substances, we want an environmental impact assessment done of Area 51. So the government came back and said Area 51 doesn't exist, so we cannot do an environmental impact assessment. So then what happened was, they bought satellite photographs from the Russians to prove that Area 51 existed. The judge accepted that. So the Clinton administration agreed to do an environmental impact assessment. It was completed, and then they immediately classified it. They said, national security, we cannot release it. And Bill Clinton, under an executive order, whatever it's called, every 6 months, reclassified that information. So the data existed, but the Democrats refused, Clinton administration refused to release that data, because it became available under FOIA. That's sort of, it's possible to get the information. It's worth doing blanket FOIAs. If you're a journalist or if you are doing it in the public interest, you get the information for free. It can take a long time, but you can get some very interesting information out of that. And ultimately, we do know a lot more about Area 51, but this is almost now 20 years later from the original lawsuits that Jonathan Turley, who's the lawyer who worked on that case, filed. So, Alex.
I wonder if you could say a bit about how the technologies used in the war of or on terror have transited back to the United States, both in the ways that companies like Halliburton have been employed to police urban environments like, I think, New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, or how drone technology has been used by police forces in Los Angeles and New York, or about how U.S. police forces go to Israel for training on various counterinsurgency practices. How is the foreign war abroad being brought home?
Halliburton was doing reconstruction of Navy bases in New Orleans, but there were Blackwater people, who were doing security in New Orleans. So you were 99% right. The thing is, there's an army of individuals who now that their jobs, are over there, looking for work back in the States, oddly enough, this is something that for the last 10 years, after people leave these jobs, or because people want these jobs, as they've shut down, they've started to look for more jobs, and they start Googling around. And for some reason, they come across my name. So at least once a week, I get an email and a phone call sometimes, less so these days, of people calling me up thinking I'm Halliburton, looking for jobs back in the States. It's really kind of bizarre, but I have a folder of just job requests, Can you help me get a job in Iraq to drive a truck, or do private security or some such thing? So there aren't as many jobs, but the technology, right? So remember, the people who went to Iraq and Afghanistan often typically were not the cream of the crop. They were people who needed the jobs and were willing to work for high pay. On the other hand, the technology is coming back. So I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. For drone technology, and I met this guy whose job was to work for licensing of drones in federal airspace. So you cannot, in order to get a license to use the technology in U.S. airspace, you have to prove a safety record, right? If you don't have a safety record, you can't fly there, right? So what they're doing is they're using their records from Iraq and Afghanistan to say they tested all these drones in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. They're taking those records and they're now saying this means we can use it in the United States, and they're using it to police the US-Mexican border. They're using Department of Homeland Security has drones that go up and down the Atlantic coast. So it is slowly becoming, technology that is available to domestic police forces, it's I don't want to use this comparison because it's not the best comparison, but a lot of medical experiments were done during the Second World War, right? That became incredibly useful later on to medical researchers, but also, for the military and things like that. And the same is true today. The military is generally at the forefront of technology. So when you experiment with drones and you figure out how you can use them, it starts to have sometimes civilian uses to track people down in earthquakes and avalanches and things like that. But it is becoming, I got a pitch actually from a company because I wrote about this stuff, and they said we want to demonstrate our technology that we use. So they do work for NATO in aggregating data feeds from drones. And I forget the name of the company is Modus Operandi, and then in Naples, Florida, so you can look them up. So they said we will demonstrate to you how technology we can use by the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. And I said, are you sure you really want to show this to me? Because I'm like a critical journalist. And they said, oh yes. And then they backed out at the last moment. But they said, we want to prove to you that this technology works worked in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq, and therefore this can be used for border control. So it has become, and now they have this plan to build a fence along the U.S. Arizona border mostly that failed, and now they're really they had surveillance cameras and the cameras didn't work and that sort of thing. So now they're saying, well, we want to use drones, and it's slowly, that is really becoming the wave of the future for certainly border control, but I think also for domestic policing. So I had.
Has your extensive research on contractors brought you to Beirut at all? I know you mentioned the CIA contract. You mentioned Bechtel. I know Bechtel is the sponsor of one of the schools here at AUB.
Well, I've been here a few times, generally to visit friends. I actually came here once. So the simple answer is there's actually, I was actually going to tell you, I'll tell you a story actually about Lebanese contractors, because there are a lot of Lebanese contractors. In fact, the last time I gave a talk at AUB, all I talked about was Lebanese contractors, and then I got a little worried that people would get upset. But there are a lot of Lebanese contractors. But the only time I actually came to do research here was when they brought a lot of ex-Iraqi, in 2006 or so, a lot of the people who worked in the Iraqi oil industry, rather than meeting in Baghdad, came here, so we met with them here. So I have done research and stuff over here, but it was just like, it was like a conference for former ministry people and petroleum contractors and that sort of thing, hosted by George Soros's Open Society Institute. But let me, since you asked me about Lebanon, there are a lot of Lebanese contractors in this war, and one particular case that I think is a good one is one of a man by the name of Wadi al-Absi. Does his name ring a bell to anybody here? He has not lived in Beirut for a long time. He was born in Beirut, grew up here. He's a Christian Lebanese. He owned a company called First Kuwaiti Construction Company. So has anybody heard of him? How do you know of his name, Wadi al-Absi?
Now he's like involved in basketball.
In what?
Involved in basketball. He's like making money for
Basketball.
He owns a
In basketball?
Basketball.
Really? Okay. So Wadi al-Absi was moved to Kuwait during the civil war here, where he claims, a laborer, and he was doing drywall and that sort of thing. And he then started his own company in Kuwait, and he did construction there. And eventually, when the Americans came, and he spoke perfect English, etc., and was, knew how to deal with the Americans, he started to get contracts to do subcontracts for Halliburton. Eventually translated, he created this company called First Kuwaiti, and by about 2006, it was $1 billion company. And the big contract he won was the contract to build the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. It was a $600 million contract. It was very controversial for two reasons. One, it was way over budget. It was badly done, so it didn't work, the construction was not good. But he was most famous for a series that we actually wrote about, was for his use of Filipino labor, where he imported labor from the Philippines, paid them badly, told them they were coming to work in Kuwait, and then forced them to go over, it's alleged, to Iraq. And then a bunch of them, there's one particular guy called Ramil Atencio, who escaped with the help of a Filipino Marine and came back to Kuwait and then told his story. So yeah, there are quite a few. I don't track people based on their countries of origin as such, but there were quite a number of Lebanese. There's another area where there were a lot of Lebanese. There's a company called L3, and they had 10,000 translators in Iraq. And the translator's job was to translate between American troops and local people. So they would hire Kurdish people, Iraqi people, and the managers of the translators were people who spoke perfect English and perfect Arabic, who were typically Lebanese. So there were a lot of Lebanese there, and they didn't have the best record for personnel management or whatever. So I'm not trying to knock. This is why I didn't want to. Last time I felt like maybe people would think I was criticizing. I can tell you about bad Indian contractors too, but I won't, because the Indian consulate is here and I have to go visit my family. No, I'm just kidding. But other questions? Go ahead.
Given that it's sort of common knowledge that GRS is a unit of the CIA, Blackwater works for Halliburton, how do these contractors provide plausible deniability to the government when the association is known?
Well, GRS's name has really only been known in the last year. GRS is actually not a company. GRS is actually a unit of the CIA that hires individual contractors. So if you work for GRS, let's see, so if you work for Blackwater, you're a contractor. So Blackwater does work for GRS, which is a unit of the CIA. But typically you have diplomatic cover. So Raymond Davis, for example, had a diplomatic passport when he was in Lahore. So his employment didn't say GRS, it said diplomatic IT, typically IT consultant is often what they say. There's actually a really good example of the people who were, I don't know how much people know about Abu Ghraib. I'm sure people have heard of Abu Ghraib and the torture there. Well, there were a lot of American soldiers involved, but there were also a lot of contractors involved. And in particular, there's a company called Khaki. And the Khaki people who worked there worked for on an IT contract, technically, but actually they were interrogators. And the contract was a Department of State contract issued from a small town in Arizona, whose name I've forgotten now for a second. It's down by the Mexican border. And I went to that contracting office, and then I realized where it was. It was actually physically not in the town, but it was actually inside the military base that was an intelligence training base. So had you looked at the contract and you spent a lot of time thinking about it, you realize that this IT contract was issued at the interrogation training base. And why was it done? Well, somebody had thought about that. So that's the plausible deniability. The contracts are elaborately constructed. So you come in as an IT person, and you come in as a diplomat or some such thing. You come in as a journalist, you don't come in as GRS because that would blow your cover, right? So I think that's the simple answer. When I was flying here, I ran into a guy in Frankfurt, and he was like unshaven, and he had this backpack, and he had all this equipment spilling out of it, right? And and they pulled it all out, and I just looked at the equipment, and I'm like, "Do you work for ITAP? Some acronym, whatever it was." I knew it when I asked him, and he looked at me. He was like, "No, but I work for their sister agency, and it's the OTI, Office of Transition Initiatives," because I assumed he was coming here to work on Syria, and he was carrying all this equipment to do, surveillance equipment, etc. And he said, "No, actually I work for a sister organization, which is also funded by USAID, but that's a good thing." But the funny thing is, he never told me what he did. And I was like, if I were him, I'd say, well, why would you know what I do? Because he had a diplomatic passport. The reason I realized, I looked at the equipment, and this diplomatic passport fell out of his bag. And he was clearly American. So I said, do you work for OTI? Are you working on Syria or some such thing? He said, I am working on Syria, and I work for a slightly different agency. I said, so do you do the mesh? Do people know what the mesh networks are? These are internet in a box. So you can use your cell phones to create an internet system in a room, and then you can connect it. These are new technologies that the US is trying to provide to Syrian rebels and things like that. So I didn't say, do you work for GRS? Because he would probably not answer that, but I thought it would be reasonable to say, are you helping the Syrian refugees? And he said, no, well, kind of, yes. So, but for all I knew, he worked for GRS, so.
What's the mesh thing?
Sorry, there is and actually when I spoke to him, I used the wrong acronym. The actual project that does the mesh stuff is a project called ITAP, ITAP, which is also State Department and funded by USAID. So essentially what the US government is trying to do, and this is a very cool project, and all my friends who are hackers who work with groups like WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, etc., actually work with these guys too. So what they do is they provide simple technologies to enable people to communicate in difficult situations. So the mesh network itself is a way of creating, I'd have to go back, look it up, but it's a way of I'll get back to you on it. But essentially it's a way to create a local internet network where there's no... In Syria, if you want internet or I don't know about, well, I'm sure this is true. When I've been to Syria once, and if I wanted internet, you have to buy a SIM card, register your name with the government, right? And if you want an internet connection, you register your name with the government, and of course they can track you, right? They use an American company, actually, oddly enough, for this, a company called Blue Coat from Silicon Valley. And Blue Coat's not very happy about it, but they bought the technology from this Iranian third-party agent in Dubai. Another story, a longer story. But so, how do you communicate with each other? Well, you use your internet connection to create a closed network, as I understand it. So there's a lot of new technologies that are being created. So for example, on your cell phone, for example, if you take a photograph, somebody could take the information out of your phone. So one of the technologies they're working on now is how to save your data to your SIM card, but not to your phone hard drive, so you could take the SIM card out. So there's a lot of very innovative technologies that are being created for communications, like there's something called the Tor net. Do people know what the Tor browser is? So it's a way of doing private internet browsing, which the military or the surveillance agency should not be able to track. Again, ironically, it was created by the Navy, but it's being developed by a bunch of activists with government money. But it is a pretty secure way, if you do this correctly, if you use the Tor browser bundle to do secure browsing and secure communication. So the US government is putting a lot of money into that. So if that answers your question. I can point you, a good place if you want to know about just, I'm not sure if this was the question, but if you're interested in this, download something called the Crypto Party Handbook if you're interested. I really like to promote this to people. It's not perfect, but if you're worried about being surveilled by the US government or the US military or the Zionist entity or whatever it is, download the Crypto Party handbook, and it tells you how to use technology that will allow you to communicate securely, browse securely, save data securely, transfer data securely, etc. So just a little plug for that, even though that wasn't your question. So other questions?
We can end there.
Okay.
No. You can't have Facebook in the title and not.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. So that's another. The thing is, I sort of run too many things to talk about, and it gets very complicated. But I did mention Facebook, and what else did I mention?
Just do Facebook.
Well, Facebook is not a very secure way to communicate at all. Just in case people didn't know that, Facebook claims that they won't sell your data to anybody else. But Facebook, of course, complies with government requests in any country, whether it's in the United States or in China. So if the government comes and says we want this data for surveillance purposes because we think this person is a terrorist, they hand that data over, right? So you have what I call, I'm trying to divide people up into three groups. There's the data providers, there's the data brokers, and there's the data hackers. So the data providers are the people that we use. We either pay them, so in the United States you either have a phone contract with AT&T or Verizon, and then those companies will hand your data over to the government. Or you have Facebook, an app, or Twitter, which you get for free in return for advertising. And the data providers give you that data. You assume that means your data is private. But of course, if you look at any of those terms of reference, they say, once you put something on Facebook, it becomes our data. And they then sell it to the data brokers. So that was the data providers. The data brokers are people who are trying to sell you advertising. So the reason, when you're on Facebook, you see all these ads, or even if you're on Google, these ads that say, oh, you were looking for a Porsche in Jamaica, well, could we interest you in a Rolls Royce or whatever, whatever it is, they advertise something, right? And so the data brokers are buying that data from Facebook to sell it and make money out of it. That's why Facebook is free, right? But it means it can be monetized by the data brokers. So data providers, data brokers. And then there's the data hackers. So these are companies that are employed by government intelligence agencies. They're called LI or LEA, law enforcement agencies. So they're LEA companies, and between ourselves, WikiLeaks, and Privacy International, have probably tracked about 300 companies who sell services to the government, by which they offer to hack your Facebook page, follow what you're doing, and then figure out what you're up to. So one of the companies that I'm very interested in right now is a company called Glimmerglass. And Glimmerglass is about 15 miles from where I live in Hayward, California. And what they do is they sell the technology to intercept the undersea cable communication, right? And so when you make a phone call that goes overseas, it gets routed from your analog line, gets turned into light data, and it gets sent over cables, through the Mediterranean and the Atlantic and the Pacific and that sort of thing. So rather than putting a tap in your house and figuring out what you're doing as the Stasi used to do, instead what they're doing is they're paying the phone companies and they're paying Facebook for data on suspects, but now what they're doing is they're getting all the data all the time. This is what the NSA wants, right? And they're analyzing it. So what Glimmerglass is offering is the ability to copy all the traffic that goes under the sea when you do internet communication and all your phone calls, and then map it. And so Glimmerglass offers the ability, and they have a wonderful presentation that WikiLeaks put up and I've written about, by which they will analyze who your Facebook friends are, who your Twitter friends are, and what you're going to do. And so now a new industry has emerged. There's a company called Raytheon, which is an American company from Massachusetts that sells missiles, right? And the new thing is a piece of software called Riot. Don't ask me what Riot stands for, but what they offer to do is analyze your Facebook and Twitter feed and predict what you're going to do next, right? And they haven't sold this yet. At least they say they haven't sold it yet. But basically what they're trying to do is figure out who your friends are. And I was at a conference recently. It was for NGOs, and they were basically trying to promote how good Twitter was for you. And if you signed up, they gave you a diagram of your friends and who their friends were. And I was like, this is really bizarre. They're giving me a picture. How did they get my data? Twitter provided it. But it's once you put your information in Facebook, like Vijay, you then, are implicated in everything that he does. So if you're on his Facebook feed, you will know that he went to, how do you say it, Melita?
Yes.
On Monday, and therefore has met people from Hezbollah, and therefore you are implicated now in his nefarious activities there, like me, since he tagged me in that post. Right? And so now they know. But essentially, this has become a new way, and before you should be paranoid, but my worry is actually, once again, the idea of targeting the telephones this is really problematic, because now if you're tracking people because of their Facebook friends, you are now entering, you are destroying and transforming social networks, but also your information is going to be really dirty, right? It's really, and I use dirty not because it's pornographic, but because the technical term is it's not clean data, it's not accurate data, right? So you're getting now random stuff, and you're jumping to conclusions. So it's much more problematic than, essentially they say there are three kinds of technology, three kinds of intelligence. What's called SIGINT, HUMINT, and OSINT. So SIGINT is signals intelligence. This is the stuff you see in Hollywood, where they're watching you from a satellite and tracking you as you run through a building and that sort of thing. That is the stuff the CIA spends a lot of money on, right? And that is actually really dirty data, because you don't really, just because somebody has gone from here to there and they loan their phone to somebody else, or they left their phone at home, it's not very good. The second best kind of technology is what's called human intelligence. And that is what the CIA is supposedly trained in, which is interrogation, counterintelligence. And then the third kind of technology is what's called open source intelligence. And that is what they spend the least amount of money now, because they're moving more towards SIGINT. But it's actually what Vijay and I do, which is actually journalism. Open source intelligence is using phone books. It's using, and it is actually the most accurate form of journalism, a form of intelligence. And a friend of mine, Matt Akins, who is an amazing reporter, and you need to read his stuff, wrote this story about the drug smugglers on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's a story called The Master of Spin Baldock, which you should read. And it's about him traveling with the drug smugglers as this young journalist and writing about them. And in Afghanistan, when they train new intelligence agencies, they give his article, and when he did this article, when he was backpacking, he was 22, and they give it to all the intelligence agencies, and then they give them the intelligence data, and they say, which of this is better? And the answer is, shoe leather journalism is much better than interrogating people, where you're torturing them or intimidating them, or using satellites and Facebook, where you're just guessing at social networks. So, yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. That makes sense?